The Arab-Israeli War of 1967, often referred to as the Six-Day War, stands as a crucial turning point in the modern Middle East with repercussions still felt today. In just under a week, the State of Israel fought and defeated the armed forces of three Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, while other regional players looked on. This swift, decisive conflict dramatically altered the political and territorial landscape, galvanizing new nationalist fervor, reshuffling alliances, and igniting debates about identity, sovereignty, and security that persist to this day. To fully grasp the significance of the 1967 war, one must examine the years leading up to it. Tensions had simmered ever since the creation of Israel in 1948, a cataclysmic event for Palestinians who became refugees and for the Arab countries who vowed to support them. The region's geopolitics were complicated further by Cold War rivalries. The United States and the Soviet Union had vested interests in the Middle East, fueling arms races and forging alliances with different states. Israel, with the backing of Western powers, chief among them the United States and, earlier, France, underwent a remarkable military transformation. The Arab states, meanwhile, received varying degrees of support from the Soviet bloc. But they were also shaped by the complexities of Arab nationalism, rivalries between regional leaders, and internal political struggles. Egypt was the most prominent among the Arab states at the time. Under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, it positioned itself as the champion of pan-Arabism, an ideology seeking the political unification and empowerment of Arab peoples across national borders. Nasser's rhetoric resonated widely. Despite setbacks, such as the Suez Crisis of 1956, he remained a symbol of Arab pride and defiance against Western influence, and he was intent on eradicating the perceived humiliation from earlier conflicts with Israel. Allied with him was Syria, itself in the midst of governmental upheaval, but forging a deep bond with Egypt through rhetoric of anti-colonialism and nationalistic fervor. Jordan was somewhat more moderate under King Hussein, yet it too felt pressure from pan-Arab sentiment and the Palestinian population within its borders, leading the monarch to oscillate between caution and public condemnation of Israel. By the mid-1960s, a series of border skirmishes and escalating rhetoric set the stage for a wider conflict. Syria and Israel clashed over water resources and infiltration incidents along the Golan Heights. Israel's sense of vulnerability, combined with its eagerness to demonstrate military capability, fueled a cycle of reprisals and counter-reprisals. In May 1967, tensions skyrocketed after the Soviet Union misinformed Egypt that Israel was massing troops near the Syrian border, presumably to strike Damascus. Seeking to display solidarity with Syria and Project Strength, Nasser took the provocative step of ordering the United Nations Emergency Force out of the Sinai Peninsula, where it had been stationed since the Suez Crisis. He then closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading the Israeli port of Eilat. For Israel, which deemed free passage through those straits of vital interest, this was a red line. The closure was not only an economic threat, but also a blow to national prestige. Alarmed by these moves, Israel's government weighed its options carefully. Under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, Israel initially adopted a hesitant stance, aware that a unilateral strike would antagonize international opinion. But domestic pressure rose quickly, especially from within the Israeli military, which argued that the best defense in a multi-front threat scenario was a preemptive strike, like it had done in 1956 with great success. The Israeli public grew increasingly nervous about encirclement by hostile Arab states broadcasting bellicose rhetoric. Egyptian radio declared that the time had come to recapture Palestine. Jordan signed a defense pact with Egypt. Iraq, Algeria, and Kuwait joined rhetorical calls to eradicate Israel, During the last days of May and the early days of June 1967, the region braced for war. Diplomacy faltered, and even though some international powers, including the United States, tried to counsel caution on all sides, the situation reached a boiling point. Israel, trusting in its well-trained and technologically advanced Air Force, made the fateful decision. If war was inevitable, it was better to strike first, removing the threat of Egypt's formidable air power on the ground. Before dawn on June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force, IAF, launched Operation Mokt, Operation Focus, a meticulously planned aerial assault. Nearly every operational combat aircraft in Israel's arsenal took flight in waves aimed primarily at Egyptian airfields, where the bulk of the Egyptian Air Force was clustered. Flying low to evade radar and anti-air defenses, Israeli pilots achieved near-total surprise. Within hours, hundreds of Arab aircraft lay destroyed on runways, leaving the Egyptian Air Force, once considered among the most powerful in the Arab world, in shambles. The IAF next turned its attention to Jordanian and Syrian air bases, repeating their success. From Israel's standpoint, the aerial dominance established on that first day was the key to the rest of the conflict. Gaining control of the skies freed Israeli ground forces to maneuver effectively against numerically larger Arab armies without fear of airstrikes. In Cairo, confusion reigned as contradictory statements emerged. Egyptian media at first claimed overwhelming victories and even insisted that Egyptian jets were bombing Tel Aviv. Only hours later did Egyptians realize the calamity they had suffered. Jordan, believing the Egyptian claims of success, entered the war, shelling West Jerusalem and other targets. Meanwhile, Syria launched artillery barrages from the Golan Heights. The war had become truly multi-front. While the Israeli Air Force secured the skies, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, ground units prepared for a massive thrust into the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt's plan, in principle, had been to deploy strong defensive lines, relying on a combination of tank divisions, infantry, and artillery. But the sudden loss of air cover dealt a severe blow to Egyptian morale and coordination. Israeli forces used superior tactics, concentrated armor columns, and infiltration maneuvers that bypassed Egyptian strongholds. Stunned Egyptian troops were left with partial orders, often encountering Israeli columns where they least expected them. In the early battles, like those around Rafah, Qusayma, and Abu Aghila, the Israelis displayed a mastery of combined arms warfare. Their Sherman and Centurion tanks, though not always technologically superior to Soviet-supplied Egyptian armor, benefited from close coordination with infantry and air support. Meanwhile, some Egyptian officers proved reluctant to act decisively, uncertain of the bigger picture as communications broke down. Within 48 hours, Egyptian lines began to collapse. President Nasser directed a chaotic retreat. But with roads jammed and no air support, Egyptian columns became easy targets for Israeli jets. Many Egyptians abandoned equipment in the desert and fled in disarray. By June 8th, the IDF had reached the Suez Canal along most major routes, effectively capturing the entire Sinai Peninsula. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers were taken prisoner, though the majority managed to retreat across the canal. The scale of the Israeli victory in Sinai was breathtaking. Not only had they secured a vast buffer zone, but they had also inflicted a crippling blow on Egypt's military capability. While the focus of Israeli war planning had been on the Egyptian threat, Jordan's entry into the conflict thrust the West Bank and Jerusalem into the spotlight. Originally, Israel had sent messages to King Hussein urging him to stay out of the war. But the king, under intense pressure, plus the swirling reports of Egyptian success, felt compelled to join in. Jordanian artillery and small arms fire targeted West Jerusalem, marking the opening salvo on the Central Front. Israel responded with a multi-pronged offensive. In Jerusalem, Israeli paratroopers and infantry fought fierce street-to-street battles. The Jordanians defending East Jerusalem and the Old City were among the best trained in the Arab Legion, yet they too lacked air cover. Israeli tanks and half-tracks pressed through the hilly terrain of the West Bank, capturing strategic points like Jenin, Nablus, Ramallah, and Bethlehem in rapid succession. Jordanian commanders, aware that Egyptian aid was not forthcoming, withdrew in haste to protect Amman. In some areas, local Palestinian militia joined the fight, but they were outgunned. One of the war's most iconic moments occurred on June 7th when Israeli forces took control of the Old City of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount and Western Wall. Soldiers who overcame Jordanian positions advanced to the holy sites. Tearful, emotional scenes unfolded as troops placed an Israeli flag atop certain vantage points, and the commanding general, Moshe Dayan, declared the city reunited. For many Israelis, this was a moment of deep historical and religious significance. For Palestinians and the broader Arab world, it was a devastating loss, symbolizing not only the defeat of an Arab army, but the loss of control over Islam's third holiest site. With Egypt and Jordan effectively neutralized, attention turned to Syria, perched on the Golan Heights. Prior to the conflict, Syrian artillery frequently bombarded Israeli settlements in the Hula Valley below the Golan Escarpment. The terrain strongly favored defense. The Golan is a plateau, rising sharply above Israeli territory, offering a vantage from which to command the surrounding areas. Recognizing the strategic threat of leaving Syria's artillery intact, the Israeli High Command debated whether to open a northern front. Initially, Israel hesitated, mindful of potential international condemnation if they escalated the war further. However, the continuing Syrian shelling of northern Israel compelled the IDF to act. On June 9th, Israeli tanks and infantry advanced up steep slopes under withering fire. The narrow approach roads became scenes of intense fighting, with bunkers and trenches dotting the Syrian lines. Despite the formidable defenses, Israel exploited its air superiority to weaken the Syrian positions. By the afternoon of June 10th, the IDF had gained control of large portions of the Golan Heights. Syrian forces, outmatched and facing morale collapse, retreated eastward. A ceasefire was soon brokered under United Nations auspices, bringing the official fighting to an end. When the war concluded, Israel held the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The territory under Israeli control more than tripled, fundamentally transforming the region's geopolitics. Israel viewed these new lands as both strategic buffers and bargaining chips for future peace negotiations. Meanwhile, the Arab states were humiliated by the speed and totality of their defeat. President Nasser, his image battered, briefly offered to resign, only to have mass protests demand his return. He remained in power, but with drastically reduced prestige. King Hussein of Jordan struggled to manage the thousands of Palestinian refugees now living under Israeli rule in the West Bank. Syria, though it had a Ba'athist regime determined to maintain radical rhetoric, lost control of a region crucial to its sense of security. The human cost of the conflict was immense. Thousands of soldiers on both sides lost their lives, along with hundreds of civilians. Palestinian communities in the newly occupied territories grappled with an uncertain future, facing a new reality of Israeli military administration that would transform daily life and politics. Israel, celebrating its triumph, felt a surge of national pride and confidence. World opinion, initially sympathetic to Israel, evolved as the war's outcome sank in. The capture of significant territories introduced complicated legal and moral questions about occupation, settlements, and the fate of displaced populations. The United Nations promptly passed Resolution 242 in November 1967, calling for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from territories occupied in the war in exchange for recognition of every state in the area, and an end to belligerency. Yet, the interpretation of that resolution's language, particularly withdrawal from territories rather than all territories, sparked decades of diplomatic wrangling. The newly captured areas would remain under Israeli control, with partial withdrawals, negotiations, and further conflicts shaping them over the years. Nasser's brand of pan-Arab nationalism took a severe blow in 1967. Many Arabs who had looked to Egypt for leadership felt betrayed by the swift defeat. Rivalries within the Arab world intensified. States like Saudi Arabia and Morocco, more conservative monarchies, distanced themselves from the radical socialist rhetoric that had accompanied the call to arms. In the vacuum of this ideological crisis, Palestinian political identity and armed resistance surged. Fatah and other factions of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, gained prominence, concluding that reliance on Arab armies to restore their homeland was futile. The seeds of a more autonomous Palestinian nationalist movement were planted, shaping the region's politics for decades to come. Meanwhile, in Israel, victory spurred debate about the country's future. Some groups advocated immediate annexation of the West Bank and Gaza, seeing these territories as historically or biblically part of the Jewish homeland. Others argued that an extended occupation would stoke ongoing conflict and that Israel should trade land for peace. This internal tension would define Israeli politics for generations. The aftermath of 1967 revealed how intimately Cold War rivalries penetrated the Middle East. The Soviet Union, embarrassed by the failure of its Arab clients, quickly rearmed Egypt and Syria. The United States expanded its support to Israel, seeing it as a staunch ally against Soviet influence. This dynamic accelerated an arms race, culminating in further tensions that would eventually explode in the October 1973 Yom Kippur War. Thus, the Six-Day War was not an isolated event, but a central pivot, shaping the strategic alignments and alliances for years. Egypt, under Nasser's successor Anwar Sadat, sought to rebuild its military might with Soviet aid. Meanwhile, Sadat recognized that to regain the Sinai, he needed both a demonstration of force and a diplomatic bridge to the West. Though the humiliations of 1967 lingered in the Egyptian psyche, the stage was set for more dramatic shifts. Sadat's later expulsion of Soviet advisors and the eventual peace treaty with Israel in 1979 would have been unthinkable before 1967 reshaped the entire environment. The 1967 war also influenced the economics of the region. Egypt's closure of the Suez Canal contributed to the rising costs of shipping. But once the Sinai was under Israeli control, shipping near the canal came under scrutiny, effectively halting traffic through that route until 1975. The oil-producing Arab nations recognized the strategic value of controlling energy supplies, foreshadowing the oil embargo that would occur in 1973. Simultaneously, Israel's newly acquired territories opened the possibility for economic expansion, yet also demanded resources to govern. Over time, the pursuit of settlements in the West Bank and Golan would complicate Israel's economy and politics, tying up resources in ways that sparked debate domestically and controversy abroad. For the Palestinian population, life under Israeli occupation reshaped livelihoods. Commerce, labor practices, and daily freedom of movement became subject to military directives. Some found employment in Israeli industries, while others faced restrictions that stoked resentment. International organizations became increasingly involved, offering aid and monitoring conditions. The complexities of governance in these occupied territories laid the foundation for decades of conflict and attempts at peacemaking, from the Camp David Accords to the Oslo Accords and beyond. In many Arab capitals, the shock of 1967 spurred introspection and varied responses, while some circles turned further to radical and socialist ideologies. Others sought moderate or conservative realignments. Intellectual debates erupted about whether the Arab states lacked the modernization or the unity required to confront Israel and Western powers. This period of soul-searching paved the way for changes in governance. In Syria, the Ba'ath regime tightened its grip, culminating in Hafez al-Assad's rise to power. In Jordan, King Hussein faced the challenge of thousands of Palestinian guerrilla fighters operating within his borders, eventually leading to internal confrontation in 1970-1971, known as Black September. Meanwhile, global sympathy for Israel was tempered by emergent critiques about the indefinite occupation of the newly seized territories. Jewish diaspora communities mostly celebrated the victory, seeing it as a remarkable survival story. Yet, as the conflict's moral and humanitarian dilemmas surfaced, voices within and outside Israel questioned how long these lands could be held and under what terms. This tension between security needs and the moral cost of occupation became a central feature of Israeli discourse. From a purely military standpoint, the Six-Day War became a textbook example of a successful preemptive strike, often studied in war colleges around the world. Israel's emphasis on rigorous intelligence, well-rehearsed flight paths, pilot proficiency, and combined arms synergy paid off spectacularly. For the Arab states, the war revealed the pitfalls of over-reliance on external advisors, the importance of secure communications, and the negative impact of top-down political interference in military planning. Western and Soviet military strategists both scrutinized the conflict. The debate over whether a more forward defense by Egypt or a different strategy by Jordan might have changed the outcome remains a topic in historical research. Some analysts argue that had Nasser not believed the erroneous Soviet intelligence or not undertaken the closure of the Straits of Tiran, war might have been avoided or postponed. Others note that the Israeli perception of existential threat shaped a mindset that was prepared for an immediate, forceful blow. In essence, the 1967 war underscored how misconceptions, propaganda, and mistrust can catalyze conflict, even when cooler heads might prefer diplomacy. Internationally, the 1967 war forced numerous powers to adapt their strategies. France, formerly a key supplier of arms to Israel, distanced itself, imposing an arms embargo. The United States, in turn, began a closer military relationship with Israel, eventually leading to significant aid packages. The Soviet Union poured resources into rearming Egypt and Syria, hoping to maintain influence. The United Nations, faced with the aftermath of war, stepped up peacekeeping proposals and tried to mediate an Arab-Israeli settlement through special envoys. Resolution 242 remains the linchpin of many subsequent peace proposals, championing the principle of land for peace. Although the immediate post-war environment offered few prospects for a swift diplomatic breakthrough, it laid the conceptual groundwork for future negotiations. Over the next decades, individuals such as U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the Carter administration sought to use the formula of Israeli withdrawal from conquered lands in exchange for formal recognition and peace treaties. Indeed, the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty was a direct outgrowth of that dynamic, returning Sinai to Egyptian sovereignty. Within Israel, the 1967 triumph had far-reaching consequences. A wave of euphoria led many to interpret territorial expansion as a sign of divine providence or historical destiny. Religious Zionist communities found new impetus to settle in the biblical heartlands of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, forging settlement movements that remain central to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The concept of a Greater Israel, once on the fringes, gained some mainstream traction. Yet, Israeli society was not monolithic. Some politicians and civilians worried about governing a large Palestinian population indefinitely without granting them political rights. These tensions foreshadowed future political rifts. Economically, the war's immediate aftermath offered short-term gains. Tourism boomed, especially in Jerusalem. Access to Christian and Jewish holy sites soared. Still, the longer-term cost of military administration over millions of Palestinians brought new financial and moral burdens. The debate over how to handle this reality continues to shape Israel's internal politics, playing out in election campaigns, coalition governments, and national policy on negotiations. For Palestinian Arabs, 1967 was another chapter of dislocation and disillusionment. The war created a second wave of refugees, though not nearly as large as in 1948. Many families who remained in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem found themselves living under an occupation that, in initial stages, offered limited political autonomy. Over time, these conditions sparked the rise of local and diaspora-based resistance movements. The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, reoriented its operations from outside territory, seeking to exploit the vacuum left by Arab states. The sense that Arab armies had failed them triggered a new Palestinian nationalism that emphasized self-reliance. In subsequent decades, the question of how to address Palestinian self-determination would become central to every major negotiation. While the 1967 war did not create the Palestinian issue per se, it reframed it. The West Bank and Gaza, once under Jordanian and Egyptian rule, were now directly tied to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, intensifying the complexity of future peace initiatives. With Egypt's defeat, the mantle of Arab leadership partially shifted toward oil-rich states such as Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf monarchies. This transition had broad implications for the region's economy and strategic alliances. Meanwhile, the defeat of 1967 sowed the seeds of an Egyptian rearmament that would make the 1973 war possible, a conflict in which Egypt and Syria aimed to regain lost territories. Some historians argue that had the 1967 war ended with a negotiated settlement, the subsequent wars might have been averted. Yet the climate of distrust and humiliation prevented such an outcome. The demonstration of Israel's military prowess forced other regional players to reconsider their postures. Nations like Lebanon and smaller Arab states recognized that direct military confrontation with Israel was an improbable route to success. Lebanon, for instance, became a hub for Palestinian armed factions, ultimately leading to internal strife and the devastating Lebanese civil war. Nations further afield, like Iran under the Shah, strengthened ties with Israel, at least covertly. A relationship that ended abruptly with the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Analysts often compare the Six-Day War to the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In 1956, Israel, in coordination with Britain and France, swiftly took Sinai, but ultimately withdrew under intense international pressure. In 1967, though, the conflict concluded with no immediate demand for total withdrawal, indicating a shift in global attitudes and power balances. By 1973, the Arab armies, particularly Egypt's, had learned from 1967's mistakes, leading to a more balanced conflict that ended inconclusively. The lessons gleaned from 1967 about preemptive strikes, air superiority, and combined arms shaped Israel's defense doctrine for years. Conversely, Arab states studied the pitfalls of partial coordination and centralized command. Decades later, historians and political scientists still debate the inevitability of the 1967 war. Some argue that Israeli leaders were deeply worried about survival, pressured by the closure of Tehran and bellicose Arab rhetoric. Others suggest that Israel's power advantage was so strong that a peaceful resolution might have been possible had diplomatic channels been more robust. Conspiracy theories sometimes arise that external powers manipulated the conflict for Cold War gains. Ultimately, the war's proximate triggers, Egypt's troop deployment in Sinai, the ejection of UN peacekeepers, and the blockade, pushed the region to a tipping point. Moreover, discussions persist about the war's moral dimensions. Israel's supporters emphasize the existential threat posed by Arab armies massing on its borders, while critics point to the long-term repercussions of occupation. The sense that the war was a defensive necessity for Israel merges with the knowledge that its success sowed seeds for future unrest. The experiences of refugees and civilians on both sides continue to shape dialogues about justice, reconciliation, and the possibility of a two-state solution. Following the war, the United States took a more central role in mediating Middle Eastern disputes, culminating in the Rogers Plan, 1969, and subsequent negotiations. Yet no major breakthrough occurred until after the 1973 war. The underlying questions posed by 1967 remained unresolved. What about Palestinian statehood? How far was Israel willing to withdraw? Could the Arab states truly accept Israel's right to exist? Egypt's eventual peace deal with Israel in 1979 was the first major realignment. For returning the Sinai, Egypt recognized Israel's sovereignty. That treaty, lauded by some as a watershed moment for peace, also alienated Egypt from other Arab states, fracturing the so-called Arab Front. Jordan followed suit with a treaty in 1994, though by then the Palestinian question dominated the agenda. In the Golan Heights, Syria refused any recognition of Israel's annexation. Talks intermittently surfaced, but no settlement was reached. In that sense, the 1967 war's consequences linger, particularly the annexations and occupations. The Six-Day War of 1967 reconfigured the Middle East. Boundaries were redrawn practically overnight, rebalancing power in Israel's favor. The conflict's short duration belied the vast historical changes it triggered. It remains a case study in preemptive military strategy, diplomatic failure, and the impact of superpower influences. Politically, it ushered in complexities that shaped the next half-century, from the rise of Palestinian nationalism to the fragmentation of Arab unity and the intensification of global involvement in Middle Eastern affairs. For Israelis, the war's memory oscillates between pride in a miraculous victory against overwhelming odds and concern over the indefinite occupation of millions of Palestinians. For Arabs, it marks a moment of deep humiliation, but also a catalyst for introspection and, at times, a rallying cry for unity. The war reinforced the notion that the Middle East's challenges could not be solved purely on the battlefield, that deeper diplomatic and societal solutions were needed. Today, the reverberations continue. The status of Jerusalem remains disputed internationally. The West Bank's final status, along with the fate of Palestinian refugees, is still a core issue in any peace negotiation. Syria's Golan Heights remain under Israeli control, integrated administratively into the Israeli state, although the international community generally does not recognize that annexation. From a strategic standpoint, the concept of land for peace has guided multiple attempts at resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, all of which trace back to the lines drawn in 1967. The Arab-Israeli War of 1967 was not just a six-day clash. It was an event that rewrote the political map of the Middle East and shaped the region's trajectory for generations. Its roots lay in decades of hostility, mutual distrust, and superpower intrigue. Its execution hinged on a combination of bold Israeli preemptive doctrine, disorganized Arab military responses, and the fervent ideological currents swirling at the time. Its aftermath cast new light on the complexities of occupation, refugee crises, and national identity. In so many ways, it became the prism through which subsequent Middle Eastern conflicts and peace efforts would be refracted. Even now, from diplomatic standoffs in the United Nations to grassroots activism on the ground, references to the 1967 lines or pre-67 boundaries are ubiquitous. The war established a new reference point in the conflict's narrative, one that is inescapable for anyone seeking to understand the modern Middle East. Whether it is the search for a two-state solution, the status of Jerusalem, or the broader debate on security versus sovereignty, the imprint of 1967 looms large. In short, the events of those June days continue to echo, reminding us that often the resolution of conflict requires more than just a pause in fighting. It demands addressing deep-seated questions of identity, history, and the yearning of peoples on all sides for recognition, dignity, and peace.